Hello and welcome to the first in a series of webinars developed to help the understanding of regulation in medical technologies. My name is Phil Brown and I'm the Director of Regulation and Compliance at the Association of British Health Tech Industries, ABHI. I hope that you find this series helpful in defining your regulatory needs wherever you are in your product development strategy. Later in this series, we'll be exploring requirements for specific topics such as quality management, safety assessment, clinical evaluation, marketing and sales, as well as post-market surveillance and risk management. But before we get into that level of detail, it's important to understand how the regulations were developed and why they were formatted in the way that they are. I'm delighted today to welcome Mike Kreuzer, OBE, to the discussions today. To kick the series off, Mike and I will discuss the history and background of the regulations, as well as a brief look ahead as to what we can expect in the future. Welcome, Mike. Mike was my predecessor at ABHI and was in part of the team, was instrumental in developing the regulations back in the late 70s. But I'll let him describe how challenging that was. Mike, of course, everybody knows your regulatory expertise, and that probably needs no introduction, but maybe they're unaware of the fact that you as well had an industry background. So maybe as a start to this, it might be useful if you can share with everybody what your experiences were in those days back in the 60s when you started working with medical technologies.
Thank you, Phil. Yes, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. Actually, my experience goes back to the early 1960s, in fact, to 1960 itself, when I was employed by a company importing medical devices, very, very simple products. They were disposables for diagnostic laboratories. Things weren't really the Wild West, let's put it that way, but the Ministry of Health, as it was then, it was known as the Ministry of Health, had a technical department which was located in Russell Square, and I believe you said the other day that you actually went there once.
I did, a long time ago.
And they took a serious interest in manufacturing. There were no rules, no regulations, nothing specific covering medical devices. And a very interesting point is that in the case of the business I was in, they actually encourage UK manufacture. We were importers, as I said, and they said, hey, you guys should be manufacturing. This is conceivably a strategic product. Remember, this was only 15 years after the end of the Second World War. And we're seeing, in a sense, for different reasons, similar approaches now with onshoring.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there are parallels now, aren't there, with this as we move away from Europe. There's a lot of discussion, I think, as well, with manufacturers as to how the UK can be that attractive place to do manufacturing again. So there are parallels, perhaps, to those times. But I remember, Mike, you and I talking quite some time back about the role of trade associations and how they fitted into this development of regulations back in the day. And I get the impression that ABHI and its forerunners had an even greater role in the formation of how the medical devices were controlled back in the 80s. Is that sort of correct?
Well, I having started in the 60s, and now move on to the 70s before we get to the 80s. Indeed, product regulation defines our industry. And the reason it does that is because it's an area in which industry can unite and can work consensually, and consequently, there was a need for trade associations to give a single voice, or where possible, a single voice. It wasn't always single, but a voice which could interface, an organization which could interface with government. Now, one of the first associations I was ever involved with was MEDISPA. And MEDISPA stood for the Medical Sterile Products Association. And again, interesting how that began. It was a typical example of a single issue creating a movement, an association, where companies got together because of the Arab-Israeli War, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, which had caused a vast shortage of oil and consequently of plastic polymers, which of course were used for the manufacture of medical devices. And it was only when that problem was solved after a year or two that MEDISPA sort of said, well, look, we're an association, we need to get on with other things. And then they became involved in a dialogue with the Ministry of Health on regulation.
So again, another parallel, shortages of oil now.
Indeed, indeed.
So I think that the MHRA or its predecessor, the Medical Devices Agency, and maybe even before then, the Ministry of Health, concentrated firstly on quality management systems and quality manufacturing. How did that translate into some of the standards work that we started to get involved with?
Well, through the 70s and into the 80s, good manufacturing practice, GMP, became a sort of watchword, and that was, of course, based on quality management systems, which were fairly new, I think, in those days, and the development of standards around that area. We worked with the Department of Health in developing this, and they developed something which I think was called the Green Guide. Now, I get mixed up sometimes between that and the Blue Guide, which the Commission issued in connection with the new approach and so on, but I think it was called the Green Guide, and it was something that people started to adhere to during that time. But again, there was no formal laws or regulations. Now, then occurred, of course, during the 80s that the European Commission or European Union, or the EC as it was then, EEC, started to develop ideas about single market. And that immediately started people thinking. And it was to the great credit of our industry that people got together with people in Europe as well, but largely driven by the UK, in putting to the Commission the idea that unless there was a level playing field in medical devices, a single market, the thing wouldn't work. And we put a great deal of effort, unlike some industries, into making sure that there was that there were European regulations.
If you, when you were working for your company back then, presumably then you had lots of different regulations around you, or requirements around Europe to actually sort of adhere to, right? So
exactly
if you wanted to sell your product in Belgium and Italy, you had two different regulations to follow.
Yes, indeed. Indeed, we did. And we used to come up against that sort of thing regularly, and it wasn't easy. And so I think everybody felt that there was very much a need for this. The initiative was led by some people who are well known, unfortunately no longer with us, but Malcolm Carlyle, for instance, of Smiths Industries, he was their general legal counsel. Gordon Higson, who'd led the what became the scientific and technical branch of the Department of Health. The Ministry of Health had become the Department of Health by then, and they had a scientific and technical branch, STB, and he'd led that, but he left that, in fact, to set up a consultancy to work on this idea of new regulations. And it was he, together with Malcolm and others, who pushed through the first of the regulations by persuading the Commission that it was a good idea to lead with a regulation on active implantable medical devices.
So how did it then develop from just dealing with manufacturing through GMP or quality systems? How did it then develop into requirements based around more expansive ideas of safety and performance?
Well, a lot of that went on in Brussels. I wasn't personally closely involved in that, so I can't really answer your question in any detail. But as I say, a lot of hard work went into that by people from UK industry, what today is the medical devices industry.
So, of course, now we've come full circle, and we're obviously going through a process of revising the requirements for the directive into the medical device regulation. And although that development has taken some time, and we're still finalising that sort of transition to that regulation in Europe, we've still got these questions around conformity assessment bodies, etc. And that's never really sort of been more under the spotlight, I guess. Were there questions just as critical in the 1980s? Were there capacity issues that we're still facing around conformity assessment bodies then as there are now? How are those sorts of comparisons made? Presumably, being such a new directive or directives back in the 80s, there were these questions. So why are we not learning, do you think, from what happened back then as to what's happening now?
Well, of course, then it was, if you like, a sort of greenfield site, and no one had any experience of this and what was likely to happen. And I think that the decision by the Commission and by the member states, who were, of course, by then very much involved in this development, to have a system of independent conformity assessment bodies, i.e. notified bodies, I think that could have been driven by potential capacity issues, but it was probably more likely driven by sort of political dogma of the time, that you had to sort of have this partly in the private sector. And it's interesting, of course, that while this was being debated, and while we were debating with the scientific and technical branch of the Department of Health, and later the Medical Devices Agency, while we were debating all these things, they even a suggestion was made that they should have their own notified body. In other words, the UK, we shouldn't have commercial notified bodies, but we should have one that was sort of state run, which is, I think, what happened in France. But of course, that never happened in the end.
Very interesting. So, yeah, I mean, I wonder whether that could sort of happen today. It's something I know that we've been sort of toying with potentially, I suppose, as a Brexit sort of opportunity. But still, there you go.
Now, Phil, I think I'd like to turn the tables a little bit. I've got a few questions for you. As you know, I was involved before you took over. I was involved in the development of the revision of the medical devices directives, the 3 directives. And that ran from 2012 to 2016. There's a lot of hard work and a lot of effort went into that. But now the new regulation is finally in place. I'm very interested to know how is that seen by industry?
Yeah, I'm almost tempted to say yes, thank you for handing off such a sticky topic as a change to MDR. But of course, you and I, Mike, through the trade association, particularly ABHI, but our European partners, MedTech Europe, were involved quite a lot in how those regulations developed. And before I actually answer your question, I think that it's really important to say that the role of trade associations in all of this has been phenomenally expansive, and regulators and conformity assessment bodies alike are always asking us as trade associations what we feel and how industry can respond to a number of those sorts of questions. But I think as we move towards the regulation, it's no doubt it's a huge technical challenge, and the timelines, of course, are always really tight. I don't think I've ever known an instance where we've introduced new regulations or standards where timelines have been incredibly tight, and those are the sorts of question marks which are always coming back. I think that the other thing which is really quite telling is that the new regulations have gone from like 40 pages or 50 pages from Medical Device Directive to like 150, 200 pages, I think it is, within the Medical Device Regulation. And a lot of that wording change, in addition to ramping up the technical requirements for products, have included quite a lot of text from standards. So instead of moving from something which is basically compliance to voluntary standards to something which is more legally binding. And whilst I can understand why that happens, it means that as a consequence, quite a lot of the conformity assessment bodies have become a lot more risk adverse than ever before, sort of meaning that any compliance issues that might be found, for example, during quality management audit, are legal requirements and legal non-conformities rather than those confined to just deviations from voluntary standards. And of course, I think that the other challenge that we're also facing within industry is that requirement and those sort of regulatory changes mean that the number of people that are required to conduct regulatory compliance within a company has become greater. So we're seeing a lot of moves within industry where we used to have one person dealing with regulatory within a company to actually having maybe 5 or 6 people. So a huge ramping up of technical expertise, so competence. And when we were talking about capacity within the system earlier, capacity is not just confined within the regulator or the conformity assessment body, but also within manufacturers themselves. So real big change means real big challenges within industry to ensure compliance at the end of the day. I suppose that shift from 50 pages to 150 pages is the same from a personnel perspective and competency perspective as well.
Phil, thank you. Yes, I think my question and I think your answer was largely about what we were all familiar with for many years, and that's the EU directives. But of course, we've now moved on from that post-Brexit, and we're going to be getting our own sovereign CA marking set of rules. How is that affecting industry?
Well, you're right. It just means that we in the UK are becoming circus performers and actually spinning even more plates than we used to. So trying to sort of figure out how CA marking is going to fit in with all of this is a real challenge at the moment. For sure, any deviation or any changes to the technical requirements of regulation is going to be really difficult for industry to cope with. We have to remember that the UK is like a 3 or 4% of the global medical technology market. So any changes or deviations from that European experience is going to mean that manufacturers are going to see the UK as a less attractive place to do business. So from a technical perspective, we're hoping that those regulations are not going to change particularly. We were talking earlier on about general principles, on safety, performance, and quality of products. Globally, those requirements are very similar. So I can see that the UK CA mark is going to really be based around those sorts of requirements. So it's not necessarily the technical side of regulation that we're sort of thinking about at the moment for CA marking, more the process of regulation. And I think that process of regulation is going to be a real exciting time for us. We know that in Europe, that sort of transition to the medical device regulation and the IVDR is causing real headaches for manufacturers in Europe. We have to learn from those experiences, but that means changing the way that we actually develop those requirements for placing products on the market rather than changing the technical bar for regulation. So I think that's the way that we're sort of looking at CA marking. is advising people that don't necessarily worry about how you demonstrate quality, safety, and performance. That's going to be a given. But let's worry about how we're going to get our products to the market to make the UK that attractive place to do business.
Interesting. Yes. Now, we were talking earlier about the revision of the medical devices directives, of the 3 directives, and that led to the regulation. My understanding was, and I think possibly still is, that there is something like a 5-year period after which these things have to be reviewed. 2 questions here. First of all, what's likely to happen when the medical device regulation, the EU regulation, is reviewed in presumably 5 years' time? And secondly, will there be a similar provision in the UK regulations? Will they have to be reviewed after 5 years?
Well, I suppose you've got to think about it. When we changed from the medical device directive to the medical device regulation, or the IVD directive to the regulation on IVDs, the technical leap was massive. There's no doubt that the sort of and it was needed. Let's be honest, because when the medical device directive that we were talking about right at the beginning was first put into place, we had no concept of integrating those products with digital processes, for example, or worrying about how many combination products there would be, and so on. So technology has changed immensely as well, over that period. So there's no doubt that technical leap was required to the medical device regulation. But if we try and think about what will happen in 5-10 years' time, I can't see that there will be a similar sized technical leap to the next iteration of the regulation. That's really just going to raise the bar so high that we're going to really stifle that sort of innovation and prevent medical technologies from reaching patients, particularly those innovation products.
But could there be a change, for instance, in the philosophy of regulation, let's call it? For instance, you've been talking recently about OBCR, and although I roughly know what it is, I can't remember what it stands for, but maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, most definitely. And OBCR is a real good potential for how the regulatory process might change in the future. In the UK, for example, we're dealing not only with that question, but how we might deal and work in a global environment moving forward. The UK is now a fully paid up member of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, which is a collaboration of the big power houses of regulation for medical technologies, like the US and Canada and Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, all of those sorts of big blocks, including the European Union, of course. So a lot of discussion is going on a global level as to how to harmonise not only technical requirements, but quality requirements as well. So it's really interesting to see that sort of push towards a global process. And that leads itself quite nicely into things like OBCR, where outcome-based collaborative regulation is very much based around that collaboration and cooperation, really sort of looking at how manufacturers build up trust within the regulator, how global regulators build up trust within a sort of a global harmonization sort of process. So I know back in the day, Mike, you were working in Global Harmonization Task Force, where there are some of those, again, more global processes for thinking about principles of quality, safety, and performance. Those similar sorts of processes of trust around the IMDRF are happening at the moment. OBCR might well sort of lend ourselves to thinking again, as I say, about the process of regulation. So maybe we could see moving forward regulators recognizing perhaps regulatory approvals from jurisdictions outside of Europe. It could mean that the regulator, seeing that a manufacturer is working in an ethical way, working in a process which is audited in a different way, is clearly manufacturing products which are safe, are effective, and are made of good quality. You know, for example, if an audit through sort of a cooperative process leads to an approval which demonstrates that a company knows where it's going, how it's meeting societal needs, how it's actually training its operatives so that the person who's making those products understands the sort of the safety requirements written within the procedures that they're working. You have much more of a holistic process to regulation, one where everybody is responsible for regulations, the same way that we used to talk about quality being everybody's responsibility within a company when it came to auditing. So I would like to think that sort of as we move forward, again, looking at that whole process of regulation, when we talk about risk, we're starting to empower people within the process, not just the manufacturer and conformity assessment bodies, but also the healthcare professionals that are dealing with products, the patient who's maybe having the product used on them. And let's be fair, patients are really becoming more data and product savvy as they sort of get more involved with using the internet and searching the products which are going to be used on them. That sort of acceptance of an understanding of risk, understanding of how products are manufactured, how regulation takes place, I think is that sort of holistic process which will allow for a much more streamlined understanding of how products reach the marketplace. It's going to be on my epitaph, I'm sure, and I'm always talking to my boss about this, you know, but regulation as it stands now and as it will do in the next 5 to 10 years is going to become much more of a business process than it ever used to be. I don't want to be and I could never be disparaging the work that was done back in the 70s when you were talking about doing that sort of quality work and how you dealt with building up good manufacturing practices. I mean, that was the most wonderful thing to do to harmonize the way that manufacturers were working in that sort of European space. But we've got to try and think of how we can translate that again to that next iteration, that next 5 to 10 years, how we can expand something which was essentially a regulatory department which was ticking in many cases those boxes to ensure that it had the right data for safety, it had that right information on how it demonstrated clinical performance, to a system whereby even those people who are selling products have a responsibility for getting back some of that post-market surveillance data to improve products as we move through the process. So and of course we have to recognize at the end of the day that in addition to innovation, which many SMEs are dealing with now, which are fabulously expansive combinations of digital and software applications, and looking at AI and how that's working with products and data which is produced, we have to also remember that we also have what we call well-established technologies, those technologies which are never going to go away, hip implants. And I hope you don't mind me saying, I remember for many years, Mike, when I started working and just before working with ABHI, when we used to work together, I don't think I ever saw you without a stick. And then as soon as you had those joint replacements, I was absolutely gobsmacked by the fact that you were walking as fast as me down through the underground and onto buses and all sorts of stuff like this. So those well-established technologies are never going to go away, and they still need to be controlled from a quality, safety and performance perspective. But we also then have to think about how we can be a little bit more expansive, how we can speed those sorts of innovations through to those people who desperately need those technologies.
Yes, Phil, really, really very interesting. Yeah, the knee replacements did me a great deal of good, I can tell you. But your point about regulation being a business process, I applaud that. I think you've got exactly the right thing there. Having said that, way back when I first started, going back to the beginning of this conversation, it really, in a sense, was part of the business process then. I think it got lost part of the way because it became so much more complex. I mean, it became more complex out of necessity because we needed to protect patient safety, as you said. It's also become so much more global. But
Yeah.
you're certainly, I think, banging the right drum, if I may put it that way, and saying that it is definitely a central part of the business process.
And that's another one of those consequences, Mike, I think that you touched on there, of moving from directive to regulation, is that those requirements that are set up in the regulations now are almost forcing the regulator and the manufacturer and the conformity assessment bodies apart. There is very little cooperation between those three parties, and separation is important, absolutely. We should never have a situation where the regulator is working hand in hand with the manufacturer, because that, as we know, is not an ideal process for many reasons. But forcing those partners apart has certainly led to a situation where products take longer to reach market, that there is antagonism and capacity issues within the system. So to actually bring them back together again, maybe even as a pandemic learning, to sort of bring those partners back and say, well, okay, if we are going to do it this way, how can we do it in a better way? Having more adult conversations around things. So outcome-based collaborative regulation, in my mind, should always have been outcome-based cooperative regulation, where we actually have systems where we're working closer together as a community and really sort of understanding how those products work and how they're used in patients. So I think, Mike, we've come to the end of our time, really, and it was really fun to have the conversation switched from you asking me questions, from me asking you questions. But I think it's clear from the discussion that we've had that in many situations, if you look back in history, if in recent history, if you look back at sort of how things are made, how things are actually first envisaged, you can certainly sort of ensure that the future is a lot more rosy, perhaps, than it currently looks. So I think that that sort of this discussion hopefully frames things for the future webinars that we're going to have, so that we'll look a lot more closely, for example, how we can do things like post-market surveillance, how those sorts of processes and the feedback from HCPs goes into the development of products, as well as looking about our relationships with conformity assessment bodies. And those are just two examples of where we can build on the conversations that we've had today to learn what we need to do in the future. So thank you so much, Mike. Thank you. And on a personal note, thank you for the legacy that you left me when I joined ABHI. And I'm really looking forward to a really bright future, not only in Europe, but globally and in the UK. So thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, Phil, and I shall look forward to seeing your various webinars. Best of luck.
Thank you very much.